Welcome to the Behavior Speak podcast. Now, here's your host, Ben Ryman.
Welcome to episode 3 of the Behavior Speak podcast. I'm your host, Ben Ryman. On this week's episode, we will be talking with Maria Sample. Maria is a Board Certified Behaviour Analyst with a Master of Arts degree from the University of British Columbia, majoring in special education with a concentration in autism and developmental disabilities. She is also a certified Early Start Denver model therapist. Maria has been working in the field of applied behavior analysis with children with autism for over 10 years. The majority of Maria's experience is in early intervention with preschool-aged children, but Maria has experience supporting elementary, middle, and high school students as well. Maria is passionate about translating the science of behavior analysis to create meaningful improvements in quality of life for children with ASD and their families. Maria's master's thesis research involved comparing several strategies to teach receptive language to children with ASD. Maria has presented research at conferences locally and internationally, has published research in behavior analytic journals, and has served on the board of the British Columbia Association for Behavior Analysis, and as a subject matter expert for the Behavior Analyst Certification Board. She has experience designing home-based behavior analysis programs to manage problem behavior and teach social, communication, and self-help skills for a variety of ages, profiles, and settings. If you are planning to collect continuing education credits for this episode, please write down the 3 secret words so you can claim your certificate. Maria Sample, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So excited to do this. It's going to be fun, I think. And I think people are going to be really interested to hear about your practice and kind of some of the different things you're doing. And also, I think they're going to be interested to hear about your journey as well as some of the, at least one of the side gigs that you have that I always find really cool to talk about. So maybe just getting started, maybe you can just tell us sort of how you got in this field in the first place.
Definitely. I had no idea that ABA as a field existed at all when I started out. So I grew up dancing and had experience working with kids teaching dance. And so that was where I sort of got started working with children. And I really loved that. I did like parent and toddler music classes at the community center and stuff like that.
Cool.
And then when I got into university, I actually went into the contemporary dance program at SFU. That was how I started in university.
Oh, wow.
Maybe wouldn't have been able to get into university otherwise, given my grades, but how I got my foot in the door. And then while I was working, my stepmom actually has a master's degree in special education. And so she was working as a resource teacher in Burnaby at the time.
Okay.
And when I entered university, she was like, hey, I know this family who's looking for someone to work with their kid. Would you be interested? It's really part-time work. It's great for university students. It's close. They live close to the university. So I ended up taking that job, and that was my first ABA position. And I had no idea what autism was really or what ABA was. But I just really fell in love with that like individualized instruction. I remember I was still teaching dance and I was doing ABA sessions, and I just felt like I wasn't, when I looked at the two things side by side, I felt like my dance teaching was kind of pointless because I wasn't getting to every student. Whereas when I was working on this ABA team, I was giving this one student exactly what they needed. And that just felt really satisfying to me. So,
gotcha. So the dance was kind of more of a group instruction, whereas you got to do really intense kind of one-on-one. And what sort of ABA was this that you were doing?
Yeah, it was, I think, what was pretty common for the time, which is really heavily discrete trial ABA. It was a student who was a little bit older and who was in school already. We were doing, lots of discrete trials to work on letter ID and number ID and some matching things and that sort of thing. And yeah.
And was that at homes or in a center or?
Yeah, it was a home-based program. So the family hired me directly and I worked with them for quite a while. And then once I started doing that, I started looking for other home-based program jobs because I was like, it's really cool. And the first time I saw a job posting for a 2-year-old, I was like, oh my gosh, I have to do this. Like, I have a young kid. This is going to be so much fun.
Right on.
So, yeah.
So obviously you kept doing it. Did you finish the dance degree?
I did not.
No. Okay. So did you switch over to something different or?
Yeah. So about 2 years into my dance program, I'd been working as an ABA therapist for maybe a year and a half of that.
Mm.
And I was really liking it. And I just started to feel like, A, what was I going to do with a degree in dance? And B, if I really want to be a dancer, I don't need a degree, right? If that is the route that I want to go in eventually, I don't need to have that. This isn't the way I have to do it. And it just seemed to me, given the work that I was doing, that switching my major to psychology would just be much more practical.
Sure.
So that's what I started doing.
Gotcha. And then that was still was that SFU you said?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so you finished that degree there. And then sort of how did the career progress from there?
Yeah. Well, I also had the fortune of being at SFU at the time that it's the joint program with Douglas College, where they, because at Douglas College, they have the Disability and Applied Behavior Analysis certificate program. And then they worked with SFU so that would really easily transfer over as part of your undergrad degree.
Okay, right.
I was able to get into that program and do that course transition as part of my degree. So at that time, I started BCABA supervised independent fieldwork as well. And then when I graduated, I think I had a few more hours to do, and then I was ready to sit the BCABA exam.
Wow. So when you finished, I think you might be the first person I've actually met that has actually did that program. So when you finished SFU and graduated, you had a degree in psych, but you also had sort of, what was it that basically was that the equivalent of that sort of post baccalaureate thing that they have at Douglas?
Yeah, so it was exactly that. Like I took the courses at Douglas and they just transferred to SFU as part of my psych degree.
Right. Perfect. And then right away you had that BCABA course sequence. And so did you go ahead and do the BCABA exam?
I did. Okay. And I passed the BCABA exam in 2012. And so I worked as a BCABA full-time sort of private practice with the same supervisor who supervised my practicum. Mm-hmm. And after a while, I realized, hey, this is maybe I should go to grad school.
Yeah.
And applied and got in, and then did that whole route.
And you did the UBC program, right?
I did.
That's right. Okay. And did you do the MA or the MED route?
I did the MA route at UBC, and yeah, I really felt like I didn't know if I wanted to continue on to a PhD or not, but I felt like, at least by doing that, I wouldn't close that door.
Yeah, have that option, right?
Yeah. I'm sure it's possible to do it the other way as well, but I'm sure it's much more difficult.
I was the same thing. I switched to the MA, but it was for that idea that maybe it could be an option down the road, even if it's not till I'm 60. So you did a thesis then? What was your work there?
Yeah, so I did a thesis where we compared 3 different strategies for teaching receptive language to kids with autism. So my thesis is actually very different from the work that I do now because it was very structured and very a very molecular analysis of what does a discrete trial for receptive instruction look like. We were specifically looking at so when you do an auditory conditional discrimination, so receptive identification, right. You have an auditory sample stimulus, so the thing that you say, like point to cup or letter A or whatever. And then you have the comparison materials that are out in the field. And based on the instruction that you give, one of those things will be the right one and the other ones will be the wrong one.
Okay.
And we don't know what that is until you say which one, because you could ask for any of them, right? So in behavioral terms, of course, that's, the correct picture becomes the discriminative stimulus, right? As soon as you say the thing that you're looking for, and the other one are as deltas, right? And so we were specifically looking at the order of the auditory sample instruction versus showing the comparison array.
Okay. And what'd you find?
Well, like with most research, it is mixed research. But depending on, we did see certain sort of patterns of responding, for kids who really weren't attending to what was going on, we would see them respond to the comparison array before we'd said the sample stimulus. So we called that an early response. There was no way to know which one was the right or the wrong answer, right. Sort of a form of faulty stimulus control. So for those types of students, it might be more beneficial to first say the sample stimulus and then show, so that they don't have an opportunity to do that.
Interesting. So UBC is not known for research and kind of verbal behavior and that sort of thing. Most of the the theses that seem to come out of UBC are either, at least in the last 20 years, have seemed to be either a heavy family-centered PBS focused, i.e. Joe Lucician, or also PBS focused, but maybe some AAC on the side, i.e. Pat Miranda. And so just sort of connecting the dots, it sounds like you probably did yours with Dr. Laura Groh. Is that correct?
We did, yeah. Having the opportunity to work with her was one of the main reasons why I applied to UBC, actually.
No doubt.
So I was at different programs and online versus in person and that sort of thing. But I'd seen her present at BCBA might have even been while I was still doing my undergrad or pretty early on in my career. Loved the work that she was doing with these nations. And I just thought that was so cool.
That is cool.
So the opportunity to work with her was really great.
Yeah.
And we're actually going to be publishing those findings. I finally am confident to say that because that's pretty much a done deal. So that will be in Java at some point in the near future.
Oh, that's so awesome.
Just sort of finished the final.
Oh, congratulations.
Yeah,
that's cool.
Thank you. I'm very excited.
Because you've already had one paper with your name on it, right? And now this one will be with your name a little closer to the beginning.
A little closer. Not quite at the beginning, but I'll take it.
Yeah, for sure. That's super awesome. Yeah, it's too bad Laura's not here anymore. She went to Nevada, I think. Is that right? And now she's...
now she's in New Jersey.
New Jersey. Oh, okay, right. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Oh, right. The Garden Center or something like that, I think it's called, which could be a confusing name for passerbyers looking for fertilizer. But right on. So you said that, the verbal behavior research, this sort of thing, is not anything like what you're doing now. So what are you doing now?
So currently, I am co-clinical director of an early intervention clinic where we primarily do ESDM therapy for really young children. So our clients are typically, whenever they're diagnosed up until about 4 years. And we do one-to-one small group therapy for those kids specifically. And then we also have a number of parent programs and different sort of, depending on what parents need to learn or focus on. So
ESDM, that's the Early Start Denver model. And so I've heard a little bit about ESDM. So how, what made you go that route? What made you go to the ESDM world?
Yeah, it's actually not super straightforward for me. But given my experience working with kids, I've always known that I've loved working with young kids. Like you just get to be so silly and excited and fun. And it's just like this whole other way of interacting that comes really natural to me. So when I started to learn about it in my graduate school education, I was like, oh, that's really interesting. Like there's some promising research coming out here. I think this is a really cool thing to learn more about. But the way that the ESDM training works is you're actually not eligible to become certified until after you have a master's degree. Wasn't really able to learn too much more until I'd finished that whole process. So that kind of went on the back burner and I worked on getting my BCBA credential first. Right. And of course, then a bunch of time had passed from when I sort of initially heard about this and became excited about it. And there had been a lot more sort of criticisms in the community about what ESDM was. And so I was really kind of skeptical at first. I had that really solid like clinical and academic training around evidence-based practice. I really did not want to be a bad behavior analyst, right? Like that was like the worst fear. And so I felt like I didn't know if I wanted to pursue that because people didn't quite agree with it, right? But my baseline sort of way of approaching these kinds of situations is just to learn more about it, right? Like I just wasn't sure. I didn't know. I knew that people had criticisms of it, but I felt like I needed to explore that and figure that out for myself. So I ended up going into the training process and going through it, and I'm so glad that I did.
So I don't know anything about ESDM beyond what you kind of told me the last time when we had a little pre-chat. I guess first off, maybe just tell us a little bit about what ESDM is, like how it works. But also, I'm curious, why are there criticisms? It sounds like it's a good approach. So.
Totally. Yeah. So essentially, the way that I like to conceptualize ESDM, I don't know if that everyone would agree with this, but for me, the way that I do this, it's ABA applied to really pivotal and developmentally appropriate skills, and in an intervention package that includes these components that are really important or good to have for kids on the spectrum, right? So, for instance, within the ESDM model, we look at having a shared control between the child and the adult. So there isn't like a particular objective about that, but we're doing that across every single activity in a session if we're doing the ESDM. And that's good practice for having that relational give and take in play, right? That is an important social skill. So there's certain things like that that are just part of what we do that I see as being beneficial, right? And then we also have good quality teaching, right? Good quality behavioral teaching for assessing and pinpointing objectives and teaching those objectives using prompting and prompt baiting and shaping and all of that kind of stuff. So I'd say it's very behavioral. I don't really know exactly where all of these criticisms come from. I'd say the most prominent one is around the evidence base, right? There are some, like the Association for, I think it's, ASAT, Association for Science and Autism Treatment.
Yes.
They published something on their website that kind of reviewed a lot of the recent research of ESDM and kind of concluded that it wasn't strongly supported. And it's been a little bit of time since I looked at this, but I felt at the time that it didn't include all of the relevant research. And of course, there's more research coming out these days as well. And I think, I don't know. I don't really know.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, you definitely, find it to be, an effective approach and something that works really well for you. It could just be like, so these criticisms, are these sorts of like general in the field criticisms, or are these things you were hearing kind of locally?
I'd say both. I haven't come across a ton of stuff locally myself, but I'd say the biggest criticisms is that ESDM is not evidence-based and therefore we shouldn't be doing it. To which I respond, I'm a behavior analyst first and using the science of behavior analysis first, and I'm monitoring progress, right? And it's not really that different than the other work that I would be doing, aside from the types of skills that I'm targeting are very developmentally sequenced, naturalistic, right? Those are our teaching strategies that have support, right?
100%. And I would argue that there is an evidence base to these. These, so ESDM, as I understand it, falls into this sort of a broader category that doesn't always roll off the tongue nicely, but the naturalistic developmental behavior interventions.
That's right.
The NDBIs, as they're called, and not something we hear a lot about, in ABA treatment generally. I mean, I think a lot of it's because, particularly in BC, a lot of our funding, kind of came about as a result of, the Otten case, and so for those listening, that's sort of the parent versus the BC government suing for, a right to, effective treatment and funding for services for autism for kids under 6 anyway, which, as been in many provinces and many states based on the LOVAS studies and the, and kind of the results that came from there. And so, I think in BC in particular, there's been a real push over the years by parents, mostly from different groups, sort of pushing the LOVAS model as the one. So, and so from that, I guess ESDM isn't LOVAS, so it's gonna get some criticism in the same way I think other models have, like positive behavior support and other versions like that have seen things. But you mentioned but there is a lot of evidence. I mean, it's an ABA based intervention. All the behavioral sort of techniques are ABA 100%. And then there's developmental milestones, which also I believe have an evidence base in psychology at least, right? If you're planning on collecting CEUs for this podcast, you'll need to know the 3 secret words. The first secret word is Denver.
Yeah, and so NDBI has really merged that behavioral teaching that we know that works really well with how typical child development goes,
Yeah.
right? And that's, I think, that's always been a really heavy criticism of the, low VAS style discrete trial training, right? One of the ways that I was exposed to that, in my early training as a behavior interventionist is people would often say, and I often said this to other people early in my career, kids with autism have behavioral excesses and deficits.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That was sort of the common thing that we would hear a lot of the time. And so I think sometimes when we have practitioners who are coming at it from that perspective, and for me in the past, when I was coming at it from that perspective, it becomes about changing the particular excesses and deficits that you see in front of you versus placing this child within sort of a natural developmental continuum. Yeah, that's sort of the way I kind of conceptualize that, because some of those key early social skills are just missing, right? We're not looking at that developmental progression. We're going to miss that. And the great thing about teaching those early key pivotal social skills is that they lead to more learning later on, right? That's a whole purpose behind a pivotal skill.
So you've used that term a couple times now, and I think that's another one that brings up a little bit of controversy in certain ABA circles. The sort of idea of pivotal skills, versus the behavioral cusp. And I know it's sort of that question on the BCBA exam that every new student dreads, because they can't seem to tell the difference, and they feel like maybe this is the NDBI folks creating their own terms for things we've already done. And I know pivotal skills comes, I think it comes out of the whole pivotal response training sort of piece. What are pivotal skills?
That's a great question. I can tell you what I think they are, and I'm 100% sure that this is correct. I think if I remember correctly, the difference between behavioral cusps and pivotal skills is that a cusp will lead you to further reinforcement, and pivotal skill will lead you to further learning.
I think that makes sense. Yeah. And anyone who is listening, and if we get to the point where I have a place where you can make a comment, I would love to hear more. But I think you're right. The cusp opens up to more opportunities for reinforcement. But then one would say, if it opens up more learning, that would also be opportunities for more reinforcement. But it does seem to be sort of a core piece of this pivotal response training. And I know I haven't seen many, or if any, examples of folks in BC that do PRT. I'm sure there's someone out there that does it privately that found it interesting. But I do know that, for the Canadian listeners, Nova Scotia, their entire, at least when I was looking into this stuff years ago, their entire sort of provincial program is PRT. Like, everybody does PRT. And I think that's why you might see some research on PRT, and PRT kind of related kinds of interventions happening a lot at like universities like Dalhousie and Halifax, because they have that sample of folks to kind of draw on. So, PRT is a thing, and it's definitely got a lot of evidence behind it. Something that I've been noticing, and we won't touch on this too much. I don't want to make every podcast interview controversial, but there's a lot of talk right now about traumatic experiences and adults with autism, and sort of some criticisms from that community on ABA. For a variety of different reasons, and I think that they've all been a lot more in the forefront, as a result of the whole of the Black Lives Matter George Floyd thing. Now, basically, rights of everyone, whether they be gender, autistic, ethnicity, and so on and so forth, are all becoming things people are talking about more and less afraid to talk about, which is awesome. I think it's great. And ABA is getting that. And I had the opportunity to chat briefly with, I'll leave the names up, but with a well-known autistic advocate that's been definitely at the forefront of a lot of this stuff right now. And I was asking him, we were talking about ABA, and I was asking him these NDBIs, and are you familiar with them? And sort of what your perspective was on them. And he said to me, I really think they're the closest thing to good ABA that exists right now. And he said, there's still some individual stuff that needs to happen. And again, we won't get into those sorts of areas right now. There's lots of different podcasts folks can listen to, which I'll share in show notes to kind of get a lot of good ideas around that. But I thought it was cool that, there's such an assumption that the autistic community just hates ABA, but it's not ABA that they hate. It's the way it's been sort of delivered in the past, and I really see NDBIs having a resurgence because of this. And I think this is why you're probably hearing less complaints and criticisms about ESDM these days, because I think they take out some of that stuff that the folks don't like, and they put in the idea of the sort of the naturalistic reinforcers, the idea that you're not going to contrive a setting, you're just going to kind of go into an environment and as anyone would, and teach based on sort of just those natural motivations. I think that's really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. That the natural reinforcement is a huge part of it. But also, this is actually a common feature of all NDBIs, okay. Is the child initiate teaching episodes specifically. So what that looks like, if I can kind of paint a picture of that, is we were sort of, in my ESDM training, we were working on, it was sort of a workshop with a bunch of people, and we have different instructors. There's four instructors who attend, and there's a child in the room, and you're taking turns working with the child. And that's how the advanced training workshop, when I did it, was set up. And one of the goals that this person was trying to work on is to get the child to give her something, to follow the instruction, give, right? And so we were trying to, I was watching this person in the training with me work on this, and, we can't actually start teaching until the child wants to be doing what we're doing with us. That's kind of the first thing. And the second thing is, when we know that they want to be there, then we need to make the thing that we are trying to teach them how to do really motivating. So I think they're playing with the car toy, and she did something really exciting with the car. Like, I think she added like an extra piece, not something that was part of the toy, but like propped up a book or something. The car go down the ramp. And the kid thought that was super cool.
Nice. And
then she was like, "Oh, give me the car, and then I'll, the subject, I'll do it again." And the kid didn't quite know what to do, but he was sort of reaching for her. And then she physically prompted him to give her the car.
Gotcha.
He initiated that movement. She didn't go and hand over hand prompt him to do something that he didn't want to do.
Right.
And that's a big difference in our program, is we really work hard with our staff. And, I've said, like, obviously there are times when you're working with young children, when there's safety involved, when there's self-care routines, you're going to need to, force kids to do things. Sometimes that's how it goes for any child, right? If they're bolting away, you need to stop them, right? But when we're teaching, we should not be forcing them to stay with us. We should not be forcing them to do any particular action. They should want to be there and want to engage, because that's made the activity so fun that that's what the kid is choosing to do.
That seems to be a quite a different approach than sort of the standard kind of pairing, where you're just gonna give them things to kind of make them find you valuable. Is there like a particular sort of technique that folks are taught, or is it just, or could you have a session where basically if the kid's not into it, you just don't do anything?
Yeah, I mean, technically that's possible, but a bunch of other things that we do that are part of the ESDM curriculum or teaching fidelity checklist that will help you manage that. So a big one is environmental arrangement. Right. So limiting the distractions, or limiting how many pieces are out, so that the child kind of needs you to be there, things like that. And that doesn't mean putting the child in a chair and putting the table in front of the child so that they're boxed in, right? That means keeping what's happening fun and keeping the distractions outside of what's happening minimal. But I also, Sharice and I talk, that Sharice is my business partner, co-clinical, right? And we talk about this a lot, is that sometimes you'll be doing something with the child or trying to do something, trying to engage them in something, and they'll kind of get up and walk away. But that doesn't mean that they're not still interested. And so you have to be really responsive to subtle body language cues, because sometimes they're just like peeking out of the corner of their eyes, but still looking at you. And if you do the right thing or the right combination of things, they will come back and play with you. So it is a lot of trial and error to get that engagement. And there's definitely kids I've had to work really hard to get that. But I've never had a session where we do nothing for the whole session.
And similarly, you've never had a session, obviously safety situations aside, where you've had to go over and grab the kid to bring them back.
Yeah, I won't say of course we do run into problem behaviors at sometimes, right? And we do those in a behavioral way. And sometimes that might include a little bit of blocking or something like that. But for the most part, we really stay away from physical prompting, especially when the child doesn't want you to be touching them, right? But yes.
I think that's really cool. I think that's and I think that's a trauma informed approach when you think about it. I don't know if that was the intention in the design. I'm curious, did you know sort of where the idea for this sort of approach came from? Like, it seems like a pretty cool way of doing things.
I don't know that what we just talked about in terms of, physical prompting, that's not necessarily that's specific to the ESDM, right? That's more like my view as a practitioner, I choose to practice. In general, like where the ESDM came from, a lot of people who are involved in pivotal response treatment, continue to work on in the ESDM. And then, of course, historically speaking, this first started in Denver, which is why the word Denver is in there as the Denver model. And then it was, I guess, applied to really young children as the Early Start Denver model. And then we had that 2010 randomized controlled trial that was published out of Washington. So, yeah.
So, again, I only have, and again, I don't work in early intervention, so I don't really have a lot of things to compare to. And again, I could be butchering this, but what I understand about sort of like things like the LOVAS sort of things is like the end goal was sort of school readiness is kind of how I understood it. And that's why you see the table as being such a big kind of portion of it, because once they get to school, they got to sit at a desk or they got to sit at a table and, be, basically table ready, because schools are table centered for whatever reason. And there's lots of different arguments we could have about desks and how it's a 200-year-old practice that's never changed and so on. But now I can't speak to sort of what's sort of the end goal of ESDM.
Yeah, I would state as well that it is also school readiness, right? Yeah, we certainly look at all those same. I mean, yeah, we're working through a developmentally informed checklist of skills as we progress through treatment. And if a kid finishes the checklist sort of from front to back, and has all of those level 4, that's the last level, has all of those skills, they're at about the level of a typical 4-year-old, right? I think there's such an assumption in ABA in general, right? And that if we don't address something, it's not going to change. Do you know what I mean? Like, if a child is having tantrums in such and such context, if we don't actually put a behavior plan in place and deal with that, it's only going to get worse. Or if we don't teach a child to sit at the table, then they're not going to be able to sit at the table when they get to school. And what that does is that completely ignores developmental readiness and progression, because I don't know a lot of typical 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds who would sit at a table and do those things.
Good point.
One of the very sort of eye-opening experiences for me as a behavior analyst was when my brother first had his first child, my niece, my youngest niece, or my oldest niece. And we were all having dinner one day, and he asked her to do something like, put your cup on the counter. And she just said, no, but crossed her arms. Very cute. And he was like, okay, because we have this assumption that if I don't train, right, this child to be compliant to me with everything that I ask them to do, or 80% or not, whatever your criterion is of things that I ask them to do, then they're not going to do them. Right. And A, who said that was important?
Yeah.
And B, who said that was true? Because Yeah. So we don't necessarily have kids sitting at tables doing learning trials in our ESDM program, but that doesn't mean that they're not going to be able to sit at a table in kindergarten when it's
Mhm.
expected of them and when
Yeah,
they're developmentally ready to be in that situation, right? We don't sit at
absolutely.
tables, we just play.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think about, I mean, again, you've sort of potential trigger word for some audience members around compliance.
Mhm.
And again, I disclaimer, I know there's no particular research per se in ABA behind this, but there's sort of the suggestion that if you teach compliance too much, then you put kids at risk for trauma and at risk for abuse, because I think of your niece being able to say no and
Mm,
cross her hands. That's an awesome skill for her to have,
totally.
and it's something that we're maybe not doing
Mhm.
a good enough job with a lot of our kids in terms of because we sort of assume as a 4-year-old, and rightfully so, I suppose, that they need to listen to adults, right? And that the 4-year-old isn't going to, the 4-year-old can't be independent and drive the car and
Yes.
and run the household. And so they're going to need some guidance, and they're going to need, and they got to do what the elders say, sort of that idea. But if we teach that too strictly, then the problem is they generalize those skills if we don't teach them properly, and next thing you know, they're in a lot of potentially abusive situations because they don't know how to refuse.
Absolutely. And even for a child who has a social skills deficit, even without, that kind of compliance training, so to speak, or
Hmm.
they might already have a harder time than a typical child. I don't know if there's research behind this or not, but I can imagine it being true. Whereas
Yeah,
if you have a time reading social cues already, it might be difficult to assert yourself in that kind of situation as well.
totally. Yeah, so that's cool that compliance isn't a primary goal of the ESDM.
Want the kids to want to be there, and we get comments from other people in the building like, oh, it's so great to see the kids, excited to see you guys when they're dropped off, and that kind of thing.
Absolutely. It makes it interesting. It'd be interesting to see. Are there? I don't know a lot about the NDBIs in general, and I don't know if you do either. But are there NDBIs? Because this is obviously the early start Denver model, and it's not the later in life Denver model. And I believe there was a Denver model at one point, but that's not really around anymore, and that's sort of morphed into this thing. Are there NDBI programs or whatever in place, not necessarily in BC, but for older kids and for older people? Because it seems like something we'd want to keep doing.
Yeah. I think that there are. I'm not super versed. I know that there are a bunch of different kinds of NDBIs, right?
Mm-hmm.
EM is just one of those. There's a CERTS model. There's Jasper. There's Early Achievements is another one. Laura Schreibman in 2015 published a great paper on NDBIs that is a very nice overview, and I can pass you that reference if that's handy for you to share.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think I might actually have that somewhere, so we'll add that to the list. That's a great idea.
I feel like maybe CERTS is also for older children, but I'm not
Mm.
sure on that.
Yeah, I've heard. I mean, I've heard lots about certs sort of um, in the field long before I kind of got into ABA. I think I was in one of those programs that was very eclectic and just sort of throwing whatever at it. And certs was one that came up quite a bit. I didn't realize that fell into the NDBI category. I definitely want to look more into certs and see what that's all about. That's kind of cool. Okay, so early start. So how young are the kids? What's the earliest one can be an early start?
As young as they can get diagnosed.
Okay.
So a lot of the younger clients who come to us are around 2 years old.
Yeah.
That was pre-COVID. I know that the wait list to be assessed in BC is currently very long, so
Mm-hmm.
have an impact on the diagnosis age as we go, but we'll just have to see. But yeah, typically around 2 years old is the youngest, but we'll get kids who are 3.5, that kind of thing. And we do serve up to sort of 5 years-ish.
Mm-hmm.
But once kids are in kindergarten, we actually are transferring them to a different program that is a kindergarten readiness, we call it kindergarten skills group. And it's a way for them to sort of support the families as we transition them sort of out of our program, because we're good at the early piece and eventually they're going to need something different.
Right. Yeah, I think a transition plan is really important, and probably something that's lacking. So is this kindergarten skills program part of the ESDM model, or is that just something you guys do?
It's just something that we do. And to be honest, it's been a lot of work because it is a different model than what we typically do. So, getting it off the ground is different, right? But yeah, it's a little bit more. We have a smaller subset of goals that we focus on versus within the ESDM, we focus across developmental domains that are affected by ASD.
Yeah.
For kindergarten group, we focus primarily on academic classroom readiness, social skills, right? Those kinds of things. So yeah, it's a little bit more limited. And then that also leaves space in the funding for families to be looking for and starting up programming with other service providers at the same time. So we can help with them.
So yeah, I guess for folks who maybe aren't listening in BC, we have, and we talked about this a bit already in terms of, the Auden case and those sorts of things, that there is the way funding works in BC and in Canada, I guess on some level too, unlike the States where it's all sort of insurance based. In Canada, it's a bit different. It sort of varies from province to province, but basically, the provinces provide this funding for parents, and it starts at diagnosis age until is it their 6th birthday? Is that sort of the timeline? And they basically get what is it, $22,000 a year or something like that, which to someone who's not in the field seems like a lottery win, but it's actually not a whole lot when it comes to sort of providing services based on paying for BCBAs and everything in between. So autism funding does pay for the ESDM, so that it would qualify.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a RASP, Registry of Autism Service Providers, Category A professional.
Right.
I'm a behavior analyst, and so we are eligible to bill for our funding. We bill behavior interventionists and all of that stuff.
So I actually have a question about that. Again, I'm not on the RASP. I work primarily with adults and staff for the most part, and not all that familiar with the RASP. So being on the RASP, and so again, for folks that are listening, that's the Registry of Autism Service Providers, which basically there's certain qualifications that one needs to have to get on there. I believe there are some folks that were in the program before these regulations came in, but now you basically need to be BCBA as a sort of a new, I think, addition to the RASP as a behavior consultant. I mean, not as a speech path or whatnot. And by getting on the RASP, you now qualify to bill for that funding. Whereas if folks aren't on the RASP, parents can't spend their money on those people. That I think that changes a bit when they go over 6, but in the young age, that's kind of how that works. And so being on the RASP, you're on the RASP because you're a BCBA, because you had, the experience and supervision doing the traditional sort of ABA approaches you were doing before. Does being on the RASP now automatically does it now mean you can just sort of, because you're a BCBA on the RASP, that's why you can bill for ESDM? Or is ESDM somehow fit on the RASP, if that makes sense? The second secret word is balance.
Sure. It doesn't specifically state ESDM is, a billable service or ESDM is not a billable service. But again, I kind of touched on this earlier, although I didn't really say it explicitly, but I think ESDM is ABA, right? ABA
sure
permeates everything that ESDM does. Yeah. And the RASP funds are for early intervention services, and a behavior consultant would implement ABA services. So that's all under the same umbrella. And I haven't heard anyone say otherwise.
Sure. I guess the question is could you bill for dolphin therapy?
Absolutely not.
Okay. As a BCBA.
You need to do as a BCBA.
Yeah. Okay.
Although you're correct, there's less restrictions on how the government autism funding can be used if people are over 6, right? It's you only need to be on the RASP in order to access funding if you're for programming for kids under 6, because higher dollar amount that's associated with that.
Yeah.
It's actually quite challenging to get on the RASP. you need not only do you need, so you need to have quite a bit of experience with young children and being overseen by someone who is on the RASP. So I had tons of experience with really young kids because that's the area that I focused on in early intervention. So it wasn't really that difficult for me to get on the RASP once I was had the credentials for it. But other people that I've worked with where they don't have quite enough experience and they've been denied, even though that they're very qualified people. So it's challenging for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And one of the many reasons why I'm not on the RASP. So did you have to make any kind of modifications, I guess, to how you implement the ESDM as we kind of moved into sort of this telehealth model that a lot of folks are in?
Oh my gosh, yes. Yeah, COVID was, it's been a rough year. It's a very difficult year as a clinical director of a center because it's just been a lot for us to navigate and manage. I can't say that we were able to implement ESDM over telehealth. We were able to do some telehealth kind of therapy for some of the kids on our caseload when we shut down our clinic due to COVID. I'd say it was ESDM inspired. Just not the same as being in the room with a child.
Sure.
Right? Our primary goals there were really to just maintain a relationship and maintain some of the skills for when we open back up, and anything on top of that was like the cherry on top, right? Like we do a lot of parent support and coaching over telehealth, and that that's a little bit different, but yeah.
And so you only started doing this not long before kind of COVID hit, as far as the ESDM piece, is that right?
Yeah, I'd had experience here and there, but I'd really been like our clinic opened February 2019.
Oh, 2019. Oh, okay, so you'd been open
2019.
So you had been open a year prior to the COVID crisis hitting. Oh, okay, I see. Good. So you did have a bit. You mentioned parent coaching and that sort of thing. And so is that also part of the ESDM model, or what's that?
Yeah, that's a component that's really heavily emphasized in ESDM, although getting training and certification as a certified therapist is not the same as getting training and certified as a parent coach. It's a separate training program and separate skill set, which when you think about it, makes a lot of sense because working with children is not the same as working with adults.
Sure. Yeah.
So yeah, but it is very heavily emphasized within the model and also within our program, because like you mentioned, the government funding is woefully insufficient to cover the types of, or the amount of intensity of intervention that is recommended by research to be effective, right? We're looking at 20 plus hours a week of therapy in order to do that. And we're just not able to fit that within our government budget here. You mentioned that the funding was set up as a result of this court case, and that was in 2002, I believe it was first established.
Right.
It increased by $2,000 in, I want to say that late, like 2009, 2010, 2011, something like that. But aside from that, it hasn't really changed.
Right.
And of course, living, inflation, minimum wage, all of those things have increased dramatically. So we find ourselves trying to get the same amount of therapy with a budget that is in essence shrinking because it hasn't kept up with inflation.
Yeah.
So I'd say that parent component is something that we are really trying to emphasize heavily at our center. And we actually set aside budget for this, for our senior staff to work directly with parents, because that's just going to extend the learning that the child's getting throughout the day.
So I suppose the idea, yeah, exactly what I was just going to say. So, because how many hours does the average student get right now?
Within the government funding, one-to-one program, they're going to get about 7.5 hours a week of therapy without going over budget. Some families choose to enroll their child in more than that, and they need to understand, of course, that they're going to be paying out of pocket at some point. And yeah, this whole year has been weird because of COVID, but in general, that's how it goes.
So with that 2010 study that they did, was that 20-hour plus mark? Did that number come out of that as well, or Is that an ESDM number?
Yeah, I think that's, it used to be 40 hours a week, right? Because that's what they did in the low-VAS studies.
Right.
And I think there have definitely been other studies that have looked at that intensity. We don't really have a prescription amount child given symptoms, right? Like that would be really nice to have that research, but we don't have that. But yeah, 20 hours a week has been, I think, is sort of a moderated amount given that it's kind of insane to expect a young child to participate in therapy for 40 hours a week.
Yeah.
So 20 hours a week is, I think, a little bit more palatable for families and for kids.
For sure.
And I believe that there are research studies that use that number as well. And I think the 2010 study is one of them.
Yeah, I'd heard, I think it was Justin Leaf. He was doing a lot of elaborating on this. And apparently the 40 hours is actually an average. I haven't really looked into it that much. And so, in fact, that some of the kids in that original study may have had as little as 15 hours, apparently, and been successful. So it's possible that came there. But now you guys get 6 or so hours. And so this is where the parent coaching, I guess, becomes really integral, because then you can sort of continue those hours at home by the parents implementing
absolutely
sort of similar things. And so the parent coaching that you're doing, is it generally on the same sorts of programs that you're doing in the center, but carried over?
Yeah, that depends. That absolutely depends on where the family and the child is at and where the needs are, right? Typically, if we're getting a referral for a really young child, they're usually so young that not a lot of problem behavior has developed at that age. And so a skill acquisition model using the ESDM, so teaching parents to use these strategies with their child at home, is going to be probably a better approach in that situation to start workflow building and that kind of home. We also get some kids who, have a really difficult time with, being told no with things, or having things not go their way, or having people not play the way that they want to. That's, I think, a relatively common thing that comes up with kids on the spectrum, right? Due to that rigidity and insistence on sameness, part of that diagnostic criteria. And so we've actually also worked with Kelsey Ruppel with the FTF Behavioral Consulting Group. And we've done the Balanced Parent Coaching program through them, doing that with a number of our families to help families work directly on flexibility, essentially, with their kid, using those same sort of principles of the skills-based treatment from Dr. Hanley's model of communication, toleration, and cooperation.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind hearing more about Balance. So Balance is the program you're using. You're not doing the ESDM one right now. You're thinking maybe down the road you might do the ESDM.
Yeah, I'm not a certified parent coach yet. We worked a little bit with Lori Vismara, and she's given us, we've done some consultation with her. She consults to us on a clinic. She's an expert in ESDM and parent coaching, and so she's given us some tips here and there, but neither Sharice nor I are certified at this point.
So the Balance program, first off, so do you have a certification now in that of some sort, or?
Not necessarily, but I completed the course with them.
You did the course, you did the work. So it's not necessarily a certified training. I've heard lots of good things about Balance. And so Balance, I guess for folks that don't know, it's something that sort of came out of all of the Greg Hanley's work and his team around this whole practical functional assessment and the skill-based training, the SBT for short, which has become super popular these days. And Balance, is that a part of that program? Is that what that is?
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Hanley also did some research with some other people on the preschool life skills. And so that's sort of another area that informs the Balance program. And so what Balance is specifically is a parent-implemented treatment for emerging problem behavior. So not necessarily situations where problem behavior is very severe, because you might need to go a different route in terms of, having a professional lead the training. But with Balanced Parent Coaching, you're working directly with the family and walking them through, essentially going through really sort of dumbed down doesn't sound quite right, but like really sort of simplistic versions of that, because the kids don't have severe problem behavior, we don't need to be as analytic. We still individualize. But yeah, working with families to have them implement it directly with their kids.
I really like that sort of, again, that preventative kind of approach. What does emerging problem behavior look like? Like, what's that even mean?
That's a great question. I think the way that I can't think of that word either. Oh my word. The way that I kind of conceptualize that is that if problem behavior is emerging, it might still be developmentally appropriate, but it might be to a greater intensity or more frequently than, say, a typically developing child. And it's one of those things where I know I said earlier that, we make assumptions sometimes that if we don't intervene on something that it's not going to get better. But often with emerging problem behavior, it's something that's sort of ramping up or it's on the increase, right? And it's usually has to do with those diagnostic characteristics around rigidity or repetitiveness that involve an intensity that is difficult for the family to manage.
So can you give an example of what that might look like to someone? Like if a parent was watching their child do something?
Yeah, sure. So we actually find that it's very common that kids will have difficulty with like accepting other ideas in play or doing things the way that somebody else will do. This is also, I'll say, much more common when we get kids who come into the clinic at like 3 or 4 versus 2. Or we might see that even if they've been with us since they're really young, it might start to come out a little bit more once they hit like 3, 4 years old. But they just have more language. They have more understanding of the world. They understand that they can control things. And so they want to. But say, for instance, I've had kids where you just place the tiniest bit of sort of reasonable demand and it becomes a huge, tantrum. Or, it develops into every time we put any activity away, there's a tantrum about that. And there's tears and there's crying. And those might be situations where we just can't seem to quite get past this, right? It's not like a short phase.
So what does the balance model look like? How do you implement that?
Yeah. So it's a series of steps that you go through with families. And within the steps, you teach the family to teach their child these different skills as we go along. The first step is really to promote play. And so it's teaching the family that essentially how to build rapport, because often adults have this idea that playing with their child is sitting next to them and watching them play and asking them questions about what they're doing. And often that's just a series of demands.
Yeah, true enough.
So we have some really specific goals that we look at for the parent and for the child in these steps. And so for promoting play, that's the first step. We really look at, we're building up this context of really fun stuff where they have their favorite things, they have undivided parent attention, they have no demands being placed on them, right? So they have all of the things that they could possibly want. The parent's responsive to everything that they say or do, or any initiation for communication they have. So it's really kind of building that context where problem behavior is really unlikely. And then every time we progress from there, the reinforcer is going back to that context.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting. You don't think about play that way, but that's a really interesting concept because the idea of sort of sitting by, are you having fun with that truck? That looks like a lot of fun. Yeah. Oh, are you going to play with that one? Are you going to do that one? And I don't know that folks think about those questions as being demands. Doesn't even know how to answer a question, and could find that really stressful. I know there's lots of kids that struggle with choice making because they've never been given a choice before, so they actually engage in problem behavior when you put 2 things out when they only want one. So that's actually probably a real basic foundational skill that could even prevent a whole lot of challenging behavior in and of itself, just by getting parents to make the car jump versus ask about the car.
Absolutely. Yeah. Although touching the materials, unless the child asked you to, is another thing that we that we work on, because sometimes it's the kid wants it to be just
right,
so, right?
Course.
So if you an issue, but yeah, I see what you're saying.
So then what's the next phase then after the play has been established?
So because this is the version of this program that's focused on parent interaction at home, the first skill that we actually teach is responding to the child's name, but it's done in a very structured way where we teach the parent to say the child's name, prompt them to prompt the child to stop what they're doing, look at the adult, and not have anything in their hands and say, so the whole idea is, if you think about the kid who's, playing with the iPad and you have a hard time putting the iPad away, by teaching them to do all of those things when you're teaching them respond to name, it's a small interruption that they need to tolerate, but it's setting the foundation for later interruptions, because you're actually teaching them to disengage with the thing, and turn towards the adult and say yes. And there is research as well that teaching children to respond to their own name, or when children respond to their own name, they're more likely to respond, cooperate with instructions that come after that.
That's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So is balance like a manualized thing, kind of like Ruby and those other sort of programs?
Yeah, it's manualized. So Dr. Kelsey Ruppel and Dr. Greg Hanley did a great job of putting all this information together. There's a parent version and a professional version. I spend a lot of time reading the professional version and go over that with the families, but then I give them a nice handout after each session that kind of summarizes what they need to do. Yeah.
And so with the parent version, the parent version, is this something that they would just do on their own and they wouldn't have coaching from you? It's sort of just parents go buy the book and figure it out themselves. Is that what that is?
Not exactly. Essentially what we do is we go over the concepts together in a coaching session that's live, like with their child and me watching. There's a little bit of talking to catch up at the beginning, but the majority is me seeing what's happening. So I can, the first thing that we'll do is say, show me what you've been practicing, show me what you've been working on, and we go from there. And depending on what that looks like, we might stay there or we might move on. And then the rest of the session is direct coaching with the family, introducing the concept and then coaching them through it with their child live. And then when we finish, they're going to carry that on and practice that throughout the week until I see them again.
Gotcha.
So the form is more of like a reminder of the things that we covered together, but not a for working with them.
Right. And so how much time would you spend with a parent during a week doing the coaching versus them going home?
45 minutes to an hour would be sort of our session. And then their practice should be sort of 5 to 10 minutes a day.
Oh, wow. So that's not much. It's a pretty low demand for the parents.
Manageable, for sure.
That's really awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because I know a lot of, sort of home-based even behavior plans often end up being pages and pages and pages and sort of too much for them to handle. So that's great. Is it a curriculum, or is it just sort of does it have a beginning and an end?
Yeah. So we start off with response to name, like I said. Then we work on teaching a functional communication response. So we teach the child to do a simple and then a complex version. The way that this is framed for the parents is teaching them to use their words, and then improve the way that they're using their words. We actually teach tolerance to denial, right? So we add in a denial signal and we teach them to say okay or to accept in some way. We also do work with a family once we get to working on more than one thing. They're semi-randomly rotating what they're asking each time. So alternating between response to name and using these words, or, depending on we end at different points, much like with those who are familiar with that. And so the handout also has like a little checklist that they can follow to tell them which one to do each time, to have them sort of keep that in mind. Once we do tolerating denial, we add in cooperation, starting with just one simple, quick instruction and building from there. And so we teach kids to cooperate a little bit and then teach them to cooperate a lot. And then we start working on different instructions, different areas, and removing sort of, at the beginning, we introduce these bins. So it's fun bin and task bin. And we show them that when we're doing fun bin, all of these fun things are happening. But eventually we get to the point where we take the bins away and we just do it in natural routines.
The third secret word is parent. So balance program, being part of the whole PFA SBT, group. Again, I don't know a whole lot about PFA and SBT beyond the few webinars that I've watched, but it seems like a pretty, complex process. There's a lot of steps, and there's there's these sort of contextually appropriate behaviors, CABs they call them, and it starts to look like a bit of a tree, and they have tree terms, even like branches and so on and so forth. And it gets quite complicated, and thus, requiring, substantial mentorship and support to kind of get through all that. It sounds like I would hope that the balance program isn't this complex. No?
No, it's definitely not that complex. And I think that's also, at the beginning, we do a baseline assessment where you actually get the parent to ask the child to do instructions, just see what that looks like. And if you're finding that in that, 5-minute clip where the parent placed a little bit of demand, if you're seeing some major problem behaviors, then that's a real cue that this is not the approach for that family. Going to need something that's more structured, like the skills-based treatment
Gotcha.
process.
So someone in the balance program isn't necessarily coming in with like major challenging behavior or whatnot. It's more of just an early intervention, general
Screaming, crying, all of that stuff that's still really difficult for parents to manage. Maybe some aggression, right?
Yeah.
But they're not, engaging in really severe or really dangerous,
Gotcha.
high level of potential for harm. Yeah.
And that's when you need to get into the more sort of, intense, specific kind of programming. Oh, that's really cool. So balance program, what's the age range? Is it the same as sort of the 2 to 5, 6 kind of idea?
No, this one's a little different. It's more sort of 3 to 7. And yeah, I don't know that it would be useful or appropriate to work on these kinds of skills with anyone kind of younger than 3. Like, I don't know if it would be developmentally appropriate to have them learn these things.
Sure.
But yeah, it can go up to about age 7. And I have worked on this with kids up to 7. And yeah, it's a really great process for the right profile for sure.
That's cool. So I'm just thinking about people out there that maybe aren't, there's people that, again, because of the funding sort of model that we have in the province, we often we have folks getting handed over to other consultants sort of at age 6 or other programs. And, it's nice when you get to carry the program on and the parent can maintain that sort of relationship, but often the money is just not there. And there's lots of these sort of government funded kind of programs now for the 6 to 18 kind of category. Do you think a consultant, I'm just thinking of people out there that might be listening and looking for alternatives. Do you think a consultant could start the balance program at age 6 and do it at age 6 and 7?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you'd want to look a little bit at the subtleties of the profile and to make it appropriate, but I think absolutely it could very well be done.
I think that's something that's missing too. Is although I don't know, I don't know anything about the Ruby curriculum either. Is the Ruby curriculum for the same sort of age category?
Yeah. Well, I don't know actually I think Ruby is more sort of a general buffet of different, potential intervention strategies that are appropriate. There's a particular age range,
right.
And it's a great program and very informative. I think what it lacks is the direct coaching, and of course you can adapt it to include that.
Right.
It's very much a didactic approach of the professional sitting with the parent and reviewing a bunch of information and then sending the parent to go.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I really like this balance idea. I think there's something. I don't know if Dr. Hanley is out there listening. I'd be honored if he was. But I wonder if there's plans to sort of grow this program for as kids get older, because I think this is something that's really missing for sort of that 6+ category. I know parent coaching is a big part of sort of the 6 to 18 sort of intervention scene, but I don't know that there's any sort of manualized, programs out there. So this one sounds really promising.
Yeah, definitely the harder thing when you work with older students is that the patterns are more ingrained and they're more difficult to change.
Right. Very cool. And so balance, of course, doesn't require that you do any sort of functional assessment in the first place, because you're not dealing with a major challenging behavior. So it's something you can just kind of go into, and it's more of a preventative, again, sort of piece. That's really neat.
Yeah.
Right on. So you were in dance. Are you still in doing dancing or anything like that?
I'm not doing dance, but I do circus arts.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, I won't try to take a guess, because I think that I'll just be stereotypical if I do.
When I say I do circus arts, they say like Cirque du Soleil.
Yes, yeah. That's
what everyone's seen. And no, not quite like Cirque du Soleil, but kind of. I guess it really just started as a hobby for me. When I switched my degree to psych and was doing all this ABA stuff, I wasn't dancing anymore, and so I wasn't getting any exercise. And so I just started taking these recreational classes. I'd always wanted to do circus. I always thought it was really cool, but I was always really heavily focused in dance and I didn't really have time to do anything else. So yeah, when I started not dancing anymore, it gave me the opportunity to try this. And it was kind of that, like, the classes were just expensive enough that you really didn't want to miss them. But it was also a session. So it's not like yoga where you drop in, you're like, oh, I'll go tomorrow. Like, you had to commit to a day and time. So that worked really well for me in my scheduling at the time. And yeah, I started doing it and I loved it. It was a great way of, getting exercise and meeting people and, building community. And then I just started doing more and more of it. And we talked a little bit about how I had my BCBA for a year and I was working private practice at the time.
Yeah.
And I actually started a circus training program, like on the side. It was in the evenings. So I would like work all day and then go to the circus school and train for like 4 hours on Tuesdays and Thursdays and Saturdays. And that was like my life at the time.
Well, this was what I was kind of leading to. Do you find you were applying any sort of ABA to your circus training?
Yeah, I think in some ways, yes. Especially now that I've had to do a lot of injury rehabilitation over the past couple of years. I was in a car accident over 2 years ago now.
Okay.
Pretty bad whiplash that affected my training.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, it's always been an area that I've been really focused or interested in terms of like the overlap between ABA and health and fitness, and
absolutely
with Nick Green about this and that kind of thing. Yeah, it's a super interesting area for me. I've never really been able to like define it in a way, right? But I'm positive that it's like I used to take data on on everything that I did.
Yeah.
But that is time consuming.
This could be maybe some PhD work, I mean, I think we're seeing a lot of cool things now around how kind of ABA is expanding outside of the autism field. I see things like Antonio Harrison with his football coaching and what's it, Polly from Brett Denovi doing the MMA with ABA. And then of course we see a lot of the stuff in tag teaching, with gymnastics, and I could see tag teaching really kind of fitting nice into kind of what you're doing. I think definitely we should be on the lookout for circus ABA with Maria in a few years. That's really awesome. Right on. So cool. Well, really fun to talk to you. Really, I think it's a really interesting kind of mix of work you're doing. I know there are some other, private ESDM practitioners, but it sounds like you guys may be the only, bigger clinic that I know of, that's kind of doing this. So definitely neat to have someone kind of, pioneering something, I guess, in a way, for BC and for folks and some new ways of looking at things. We'll definitely put a bunch of stuff in show notes around, more on ESDM and some of the articles you were talking about. Definitely, once your article gets published, we'll add that to the list. I think that's pretty cool. What's the name of your center for folks?
Yeah. Up Early Intervention Clinic.
Early Intervention, and that's located over in the Pacific Autism.
That's right. Yeah, Pacific Autism Family Network.
Thank you. Yeah, perfect. That's really cool. Right on. Good. Well, thanks, Maria. Thanks so much for being here. It's so awesome.
Thanks so much for having me.
You bet.